is actually formerly of Living Streets, but now is a public health professional. So she has a wealth of experience in this area. So hopefully we will have an interesting discussion. That I'll probably have a few questions for the panelists. Then it's over to you, the audience, for your questions, and then we should all be wrapped up by before 2 o'clock. So I'm going to hand over to Chris to kick us off.
Thanks, Stuart. I'm just going to share my screen so I can show a few pictures. Great. Yeah, so thanks. I'm co-founder and director of Urban Strategy at Urban Movement. And I'm also, as Stuart said, trustee of Living Streets, and also a member of the United Nations Planning and Climate Action Group. And I wanted to broaden the conversation slightly at the beginning, and say that when we think about inclusive streets, it's very easy to get straight down and dirty into the detail of curbs and such. But I think to think about inclusive streets, first, I believe we have to think about the equal city. And here we unearth the complexity of equality, because quite rightly, no single issue can reign above another. And the equal city, of course, involves removing access to inequality. But here we're talking about the physical access we picture, but also access to opportunity and social justice. The way that a lot of cities have been organized and designed over the past decades have resulted in environments where accessing opportunity is basically predicated on owning a car, in turn increasing transport poverty. Access inequality to me has to mean that we work with the full spectrum of society to design access into streets at the micro scale, but also at the macro scale, we have to allow people to access opportunity in a way that's healthy, cheap, and inclusive. And to me, this means very much delivering on sort of radial walking and cycling corridors on key infrastructure routes that connect places that people want to go, but also they connect to cheap and reliable public transport systems at key points. And just to sort of talk about some other ways in which streets can be sort of inclusive, I think we have to talk about climate inequality more and more. We know the planet is burning and sea levels are rising, and this is going to displace millions of people in years to come. And again, at the macro scale, as a result of this, the heat trapping pollution from our activities, rising sea levels could, within 3 decades, push chronic floods higher than land currently home to about 300 million people. And then again, the micro scale of this is aspects of climate inequality affect us here and now. And shade is an equity issue in large parts of the planet. In many cities, people who rely on public transit to get around are forced to stand in blistering sun waiting for a bus, surrounded by hot, dark asphalt. So essentially what I'm saying is we need to plant trees as strategic transport interventions, because they unlock street life, they unlock active travel for people throughout the globe. And will only continue to do so for more and more people. Equally, we've only just started to think about age inequality in streets. The urban environments we've created are largely unfit for urban childhoods, and the way we've organized cities and designed streets is certainly a huge factor in the variation in age-related quality of life we see globally. Designing streets that once again allow children to safely roam, play, engage with their community streets, and creating places where parents feel confident enough to allow them to do so is key. And if we look at our existing environments, we can see that they have developed in such a way that we have biased them against children, because children's perceptual ability is significantly below adult performance levels. Children are unable to really detect vehicles approaching if vehicles are moving above 25 miles an hour in everyday circumstances. And when they do detect vehicles, they're unable to discriminate between cars traveling at 20 miles an hour and those at 48 miles an hour, even though a car above 40 has reduced their crossing time by 50%. This inequality is in the makeup of our streets and transport systems has led to the World Health Organization declaring that road traffic accidents are actually the 3rd leading preventable cause of death and disability in children. And we, of course, cannot rest until we engage with health, or probably more accurately, life inequality. And if I'm being firmer, unnecessary death. About 1.35 million people die on the road each year. On average, that's over 3,500 people every day. And that's before we start talking about the 20 to 50 million people who suffer non-fatal injuries every year, which is a total waste. And we know what kills people. And you have to say that making us entertain the idea that there is a war on cars is one of the greatest propaganda tricks of modern times, because there's an ongoing and worldwide massacre of vulnerable road users. We have to slow speeds, change priorities, and design streets for the soft and slow creatures that we are, if we're to make cities equitable. And finally, just to touch on the idea of mental health inequality. The places we've created for human beings to live in are not great for our mental health. Over half of Londoners say that they feel lonely sometimes. And in other cities, 15% of people say that they feel they have absolutely no one to rely on. But we know how we can change this. We have known for ages, at least since the 1960s. In his seminal study, which has been subsequently replicated all over the world, Donald Appleyard highlighted the increased social connections we have when our streets and public realm aren't dominated by traffic, aren't a barrier. He showed that if you live on a street with less traffic running down it, you have more friends on that street, stronger social connections, and so improve mental health. Transport investment is truly transformational. Very few other forms of investment can target such a broad set of outcomes, from physical health, mental health, community cohesion and urban loneliness, through to combating climate change and delivering more money on shopkeepers' tills. All these outcomes that it can target are issues pertinent to creating an equitable city. Take the wrong path and we organise a divided city, plot the right path and we make life more equitable. The job of the urban designer, as I see it, is to plot the path through this discussion that yields the greatest return on investment for the greatest number of people, in a way that benefits society as a whole, the city as a whole, and the environmental climate that our children have to grow up in. And that's what we need to do, I think. And I'm looking forward to talking about some more detailed questions later on. Thanks very much.
I'm trying to get my camera back. Sorry. Yes, so I'm going to hand over to Shruti now, who should have mentioned is also a trustee of Living Streets Scotland in my intro. So Shruti, do you have a few thoughts on this agenda that you could share with us?
Well, yeah, so thanks for the introduction, Stuart. As Stuart said, I am also a trustee for Living Streets, but I work in place and health and planning at Public Health Scotland. Although I'm currently working on COVID stuff right now. So I think just the first thing that I want to say is that every place is different. So what works in our cities may not suit remote rural communities, just as the priorities in our towns may not be the same as those on our islands. So a place-based approach allows us to identify and respond to inequalities and disadvantage and implement solutions that are tailored to individual issues and circumstances which face the different places in our country. So the key to tackling inequalities is to identify and meet the needs of all users in a place. It's important to gather the individual and the collective experience of how a place is used and what people have access to. And this helps to inform and influence changes in their environment. We also need to understand the inequalities that exist and what we can do to stop them from happening in the first place or widening over time. So communities living in these places face different challenges. There are more vulnerable communities who experience worse experiences, and these include deprived communities, disabled communities, people from some ethnic minority communities, and we really need to think about how these groups, how we can meet the needs of these groups and remove some of those barriers. Another important point is that a place is made up of different elements. It includes the physical environment, such as buildings, streets and spaces, but it also includes many social aspects as well. And this can be the people themselves and maybe the way that they feel about their place and where they live. So place is complex and it's interlinked. It cannot just be physical or social. It needs all of those elements and both of those elements. And because of this, every place is unique. So some of you may be aware of the Place Standard tool, which I think gets most of this right. So I must admit that the Place Standard tool is something that I work on as part of my role in Public Health Scotland. But it's built around 14 themes, which covers the physical and social factors in a place. And just to say, a place can be a street, it can be a neighbourhood, it could be a town, a village or a city. It's how you want to define that area. But this framework helps people to think broadly about their place, and it helps people in a place, so a broad range of stakeholders, to come together around a common framework and to identify and celebrate what works in a place, as well as areas for improvement. So this can be used to develop and prioritise actions that will improve places and the lives of people who live within those places and that use them. So this is, of course, just one methodology, and there are, of course, other processes and tools out there that you can use. So I just want to finish by highlighting a few conditions for success that I've drawn from the work that we've done at the national level on community engagement in place and tackling inequalities, and specifically health inequalities. We haven't always got it right and it hasn't always worked, but I think the conditions for success that I'll highlight can be considered more broadly as good practice and working towards tackling inequalities in place, all centred around community engagement. So first of all, identifying the right priorities does depend on good engagement, and this requires some key skills within the team. So good skills in community engagement, good facilitation skills, good project management skills, and good skills in analysing a broad set of data, so research that you'll be gathering. A big challenge is just to ensure that ensuring that those engaged are representative of the whole of the local population, and this is really challenging. However, implementation must ensure all communities include those who are currently most marginalised and underrepresented and are supported to participate to maximise the potential contribution of any activity in reducing inequality. And this is absolutely fundamental. Without doing this, we are only going to increase inequalities in a place. Resources is absolutely essential in working to tackle inequalities in a place, and you need to have adequate staff and financial resources to plan, implement your engagement, analyse and deliver on these actions. So just note, it's not a one-step process, there's several steps within that process, and it takes time, so you need to consider time as well. Achieving buy-in from decision makers, i.e. the owners of the plan that you'll be contributing to, is critical, and they need to be engaged from the outset. And I think it's really important to deliver actions to show evidence of listening and impact to those involved in the process and to keep the momentum going. So often this kind of work on working to tackle inequalities in place is often seen as particularly into community engagement, is seen as a starting point for identifying priorities. But it's absolutely essential that action is taken to improve the quality of places and tackle inequalities. So we need to move beyond discussion, and this is where we often kind of get stuck in some of our processes. So there needs to be absolute certainty about who is taking the action forward. And ultimately, I think success is going to depend on whether the resources and the commitment are available to deliver the priorities identified.
Great, that's really sets the scene nicely in terms of some of the stuff we've covered in this series. And thanks to Chris for his broader view of where I think we should always be thinking about thinking globally, acting locally in all of this agenda. And I think the challenge really is when we start acting locally, who do we include, who do we involve, and how do I think everybody agrees about the big stuff, but then we get into quite heated debates about quite small changes to streets, or sometimes that can be quite small changes but quite important to certain groups. And I suppose on that level, I'm going to kick off how in terms of the biggest challenges, is it actually the physical spaces we've got to work with in cities and towns in Scotland that are the real challenge in getting this right? How constrained are we, or is more of the constraint actually social factors in terms of people being able to get involved, provide their views, influence processes? So I'm going to kick off with that broad question and see what people think about that.
I'll happily sort of give some initial thoughts. I think for me it's a double-edged sword in that respect. As a designer, I think we can do so much with the design of physical spaces, but I think that's broadly because design isn't a product; it's a process. And through the process, I think we can work with the most vulnerable to remove barriers and work towards the equal city. So I think for me, it's the design. We often see the design as a physical place, as a physical object, where actually the process of design is everything that Shruti started to mention about the sort of thing that takes time, the working with people and doing the sort of stakeholder mapping that you have to do at the beginning of the design process to work out who you need to speak to, why, what they need, and then the design. So the design process takes all that in. So I think it's more complicated than having the two separate things. I think the system and design are the same.
Okay, I'm going to have a quick follow-up on that actually. So when your clients are commissioning it, do you think they're actually realize they're buying a process, or do they just want the product at the end of it?
I think design's always been a process. I think even in product design, there's a process to it of trial and error and testing. And I think the same is true of the design of a city. Although you don't. I mean, only relatively recently have we started to sort of do physical trials. So there's a different meaning to that now. But the idea of trialing ideas in conversation with people has been around for years, and that is just design. You can't. Very few people are just sort of believe they know they have the answer, and if they do believe that, they're probably wrong, because I think it's so much more complicated than that. And in terms of what we need from our streets, I need something different from my street every day at different times of the day. So I mean, the idea that it's complex enough just for me is probably is testament to the fact that design is always a process and needs to be a process.
Yeah, and Shruti, you're talking about some of the sort of social factors amongst this. If we engage people early enough, can we influence the design process? I think that's what, for me, that's why I say the place to standard tool is to sort of start understanding the landscape a little bit better before we get to having really hard and fast discussions about design.
Yeah, so I absolutely think that even after physical barriers have been removed, there are going to be social or behavioural barriers that might exist, and that's why it's really important to take early engagement and discussion is key with a wide range of groups or users that of that space or that place. As Chris said, there are things that we can do to in the planning of our processes to map out the local area, the local demographics, and to identify the users, the different groups of users that we should be speaking to. And we can talk a little bit possibly later around how we can begin to bring in some of those most marginalised groups and those voices that we don't kind of typically include in this kind of process. But I think process is one part of it. But I think as part of that process, we need to begin to manage expectations in terms of what can be delivered, but also what kind of design can deliver as well. And I think, again, this goes back to probably just that point around social and just recognising what we need to do in terms of behavioural change and kind of social change, so kind of changing cultural norms there. So there's quite a lot in that, really, and it isn't just about design and physical design and the space. It is about process and thinking about the process and who you engage in that process, but it's also thinking outside of physical design. And I think Chris said, and tell me if I got it wrong, but design can't deliver everything, and it can't. So it needs to be. I know some people use the phrase build it and they will come when talking about infrastructure, and I completely disagree. You can't just chuck loads of money to build new walking or cycling infrastructure. You need to understand how people interact with the space and the barriers that different groups face before you can truly build an infrastructure or design that works. But there's also work to be done to increase confidence in some groups who've had concerns and fears for such a long time when using a street or a place, including older people who might have felt really unsafe for such a long time. And so there's work to do there in terms of kind of building up that kind of confidence and that behavioural kind of social aspect. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think I'm just moving on to that theme. I think there's a tension in all these processes about it comes down where the process breaks down. It becomes discussion about different groups competing for space and contesting space. And I wonder, kind of how do we address this? It's a really difficult issue. I think one area is actually making sure there is more space for certain users who really need it, and that probably means taking space away from car users. But I think that's a really challenging thing. So I don't know if you have any response about space competition.
I think just from my point of view, I think it's just to echo that, recognise that one size fits all approach isn't going to work, and that there is diversity in our places. I think it gets problematic when you start saying that a particular group can't use a space, such as teenagers, or you're trying to restrict access at night, for example. So we need to make sure we're all aware of this, that spaces are designed so that all sections of community can be catered for. I don't want to bang on too much about the place standard tool, but when you're doing your consultation, you have a series of conversations with different groups of people, and you draw out from those conversations the priorities for different groups. And then you then go on and you have further conversations to begin to unpick some of the differences in the priorities that are emerging from the different groups. And so what I guess I'm trying to say there, that it isn't a simple and a straightforward process. Often it's a series and a set of processes. So sometimes it can be a series of discussions and conversations between different groups until you can reach an agreement around what is actually kind of feasible within a space. It's not an easy process, and it sometimes means that when you might have to make difficult decisions, you will have to manage expectations, but sometimes if you've planned your project, that project plan's going to go out of the window because something might get thrown up that you weren't expecting. So I guess the point is that you really need to listen to what's being said by the different groups, and you need to kind of unpick some of the priorities that might be emerging. And just to say, yeah, I'll just leave it there.
Great. Well, Chris, you're at the sharp end of trying to manage this type of stuff. Any thoughts on that? And then I think we can move on to, we've actually got some good questions coming through. So I'll move on to the question from the audience. But yeah, final thoughts on competition for space between the different people you're trying to design for.
I think for me, I think Shruti's bang on, and I think a big part of the problem is the sort of the dehumanizing of the debate that we do all the time by sort of attaching certain demeanors to groups like cyclist, pedestrian, drivers. That is a massive part of the problem, and I think we're all just people, and I think we're all on the whole very courteous. Sometimes we're having a bad day, and sometimes there's tension between pedestrians and cyclists because that person's having a bad day, not because cyclists are all cyclists. So I think that the idea of attaching demeanors is dehumanizing, and it's also it's a big problem in the debate. And I think, as you opened, I think the key issue is space. And I think from a design perspective, not taking away from the process side of it, I think when you encounter good infrastructure, which is a pleasure to use, I think our behaviors reflect that. And actually, it's a simple measure of if we encounter poor infrastructure, the human body produces cortisol, we all get really stressed, and we're certainly not our best selves. So I think the design of good infrastructure actually does invite good behavior. And I think the idea of coming down to space is a lot of the time, the tensions between walking and cycling are because we take cycling infrastructure out of walking space because it's easier. And I think that clearly isn't the right thing to do. And it just means people walking are further squeezed and simply need more room. I think bicycles are excellent urban vehicles. So good cycling space should be taken from vehicle space and made safe through segregation. And I think if we approach it like that, I think we can go a long way to sort of easing the debate.
Yeah,
I'm going to just
sorry, Stuart. I just wanted to jump back in and just to say that I think I kind of raised that it's going to be delivering on actions is going to be tricky, and it's going to depend ultimately on resources and commitment, and we will going to have to manage expectations. But I think really we need to think about inequalities and how we're going to tackle those, and really just by implementing grand schemes. We really, they might not work for all communities, all members of our communities. We really need to begin to think about how we speak to those most at risk, and to unpick what some of their barriers are, and how they begin to use the spaces and how they want to use the spaces if they're not using the spaces, and think about how we can consider sort of tackling some of those first. Otherwise, we are at great risk, and we've seen this through COVID and lockdown, where inequalities are increasing. And I just think that we need to think further about putting the priorities of those groups up there. And I think be quite radical in terms of what we're doing. And I think we know from some of the kind of history of area in this work that if we take radical action and we find schemes and solutions that work for those who are most at risk and excluded, they often work for everybody. And I just think from an inequalities point of view, particularly in Scotland, where inequalities are so vast and they are widening, and they've widened over the last 10 years, that we absolutely need to start thinking about this as a priority.
I think I have one other side, and I think it's an interesting point. I think pedestrians generally on street get on pretty well as a group. Different groups can mingle, and everybody's kind of going about their business, and it gets more difficult when the space is constrained. I think it's slightly different. The more you put speed into the mix, I think that's where it becomes challenging. I think Chris makes a good point about segregation. People are trying to do different things with the space when you're going at between 6 and 12 miles an hour, and then 12 and 20 miles an hour. And I think that's when you get into vehicles. And that other final reflection is, I think the actual what happens on street and what happens at consultation events is not as what's reflected on social media at the moment. And I'm quite concerned actually about some of the behaviours we've seen last week. There's some statements on our blog about some of our colleagues at Sustrans last week who got flagged for just doing their job, basically, and that's a blatant attempt to try and exclude people from the debate. And I think we need to be really vigilant about this, and that's why we need to speak. People need to get involved, and we need to keep the debate inclusive, and probably less online, because these are complicated issues to discuss. But we've got some good questions. We've got lots of, it's like Living Streets alumni here. Our former chair, Archie Robertson, I think it would be him, has asked, great talks, thank you. If you had one wish that could improve the social environment in cities, what would the change be, and where would you have to change it to make it happen?
It's a good question.
One wish for change and making cities inclusive.
I think a broad term of the answer would be quality, and I think to elaborate on that would be, I think we have now a sort of a fundamental shift in government policy in terms of the ambition of creating a sort of a healthier and more active sort of urban lifestyles. And I think we've had for many years, for many generations now, we've had well-meaning guidance and well-meaning instructions to do things. And I think the way that's been translated into built schemes has often gone different ways and had varying degrees of success. And I think a sort of mechanism for being able to communicate the ambition, the bold ambition that we're seeing now from communities and from government about the infrastructure we need to create behavior change and to create these different communities. I think we need a mechanism to translate that into quality on the ground that is future-proofed, that maximizes the investment for people and for communities.
Thank you. Trish, do you have any thoughts on wishes?
I agree with what Chris has said, actually, and it's just to make sure that whatever we're doing is of a good enough quality, and we have that commitment in the kind of policy background and statements that we have via Scottish Government here. So we're really fortunate, but in terms of what's written in policy and what's delivered on the ground is a very different matter. So it's all well and good putting in infrastructure or facilities and services within a place or a neighbourhood, but are they of a good enough quality that deliver what people actually want? So I would support what Chris has said there, and I've not got anything else to add.
Great. Okay. I've got a really interesting question from Wendy Shaw. She's saying best practice changes over time, and the schemes take so long to implement. How can we ensure that what we're designing and putting in is not obsolete when it's unveiled? How do we ensure we're building to last? Which is a big challenge. These things do take a lot of time, including the consultation phase.
So this is something that's come up in the work that we've been doing at the national level, and it's been around reframing the work that we've been doing on place and health to take into consideration the climate and the environment. And what we've been doing and trying to do is to encourage all conversations to think about future-proofing any kind of scenarios and design. So it's not only thinking about communities to have a conversation around what their places need now, but to think about what their communities and places would need to service their community as they become older, as individuals, as families, but also as our space around us changes, as our environment around us changes. That could be due to the environment, or it could be due to a global kind of health crisis as well. So it's to kind of do, I suppose, a two-stage process of kind of, to think about your community now and the services now, but also to kind of do that kind of forward thinking. And that is really difficult, but it's about kind of embedding that into the process and trying to encourage some of those conversations early on.
Chris, any thoughts on
absolutely.
obsolescence?
I think interestingly that we have seen recently the idea that infrastructure doesn't have to take so long. We have seen a sort of, and before the current pandemic, we've seen an increase in the number of schemes which are trialled in a roundabout way. And I think the sort of headline in New York in Times Square is that kind of the idea about actually, so let's see what happens and see if people like it, and then we can go about moving on to making it that sort of permanent change. But I think in the sort of more the street level, I think it's about the practical issue of being able to challenge briefs, and giving people the power to challenge briefs is always really interesting, because obviously when people are asking you to do something, they are very much focusing on that thing, and they're sort of with that project for a long time. And I think the idea of employing a design team and the value that design teams can bring is looking wider at that bigger picture. So if we're trying to build a cycle track between X and X, well, how do we tie in green infrastructure into that? How do we actually look at the city as a bigger network and think about the different things that we need to be done, and can be done, to actually think, while we're digging the street up for this 6 months, why don't we actually pack it full of loads of things which are going to help us out in 50 years' time? And I think that idea of being able to challenge briefs and enrich the process is a powerful one.
And I've got Joe Irvin, who I think is the Joe Irvin of Living Streets fame as well here. So I will get to some people who are not Living Streets, but it's a good question, and I'm going to aim it at Chris. And Joe used to be my big boss, so I better ask this. Chris, you've been working on the Avengers project in Glasgow. What have been the greatest challenges and greatest successes, and what have you learned from that project?
Well, it's still going. So the greatest so far, I'll have to caveat. The greatest challenge, I think, is almost certainly the scale. Glasgow is in a almost globally unique position of being able to rethink a huge number of its city centre streets. And I know that the work that some of the council are now doing as well is they're starting to look at the periphery and creating livable neighbourhoods around those. But the idea of the Avenues project is looking wholesale at sort of, I think, about 17 key city centre streets, and for those it's kind of the level of Oxford Street in London, but 17 times throughout the city centre. I mean, they're very principal streets. So the greatest challenge is definitely the complexity, but with that brings the greatest opportunity of the whole project, which is it can deliver on those wider sort of city agendas that actually look at a much larger range of topics. And the greatest success, I think, Sauchiehall Street now is complete. And I was there in last summer, not the summer just gone. It's all the years are getting mixed up now. I was there last summer, and I saw a mother teaching her son to ride a bike, and he was about 4 years old, and he was learning to ride a bike on Sauchiehall Street, which if for those of you who knew Sauchiehall Street before it was built, wouldn't have happened.
Okay, I'm going to keep going down. So I've got some comments. So Peter Monk has asked a question, and so Chris, you might be able to help with this, because I believe the cycle infrastructure design guidance has been reissued in England with better guidance on disabled access. How's that going, and I'm going to paraphrase this, and what could we be learning from that in Scotland, I suppose?
How's it going is probably a little bit early to say. The LTN 120 is the technical guidance that sits alongside the government document Gear Change, which is much more of a sort of high level sort of policy ask or document. Both documents, I think, are what we need. They are very, very welcome and very ambitious. And I think that, together with the changes in the highway code which are being proposed, could form a very interesting policy or guidance triangle. I think one sort of caveat would be its guidance. It would be really interesting to start seeing this some of this stuff a bit more firmly applied in policy. And just touching on the England-Scotland divide, I think this guidance very much applies to Scotland. I know it's DFT guidance, but the Institute of Civil Engineers, the body that charters engineers, has said that and states that every professional member in their institution has to stay abreast with current international best practice. And actually, you could then extrapolate that to think that actually they're not then following international best practice. You could follow that through to negligence if they are delivering things which aren't international best practice. So the ICE have come out and said that this is now best practice. So members it should apply to all members. I think it's very much there to use in Scotland.
And I think Pierre had a specific question about bus stop bypasses, which is I wouldn't say a favourite topic for living streets, a tricky topic. How good is the guidance on that? Does it answer the questions that need answering? There's been a few temp schemes that have come in for a little bit of flack in Edinburgh. So does it help us design schemes that are going to
It does. There are even drawings in there. The LTN 120 document, not the gear change document, which lays them out and shows the different scenarios which are appropriate for different settings.
Great. Okay, that's one to follow up on, and a couple of interconnected questions. Actually, I've got one question about putting chicanes on cycle lanes and whether that promotes inclusivity or is a barrier, which is quite interesting. And a related issue is actually using measures to sort of prevent people, especially youths, from using certain areas to prevent antisocial behaviour. Any thoughts on these kind of interventions in terms of possibly well intended but not actually going to do what they're supposed to do?
Shrew, did you have anything to come in on?
I think they're probably design questions, Chris.
Fine. No, I think I can't not quite understand the idea on barriers. I think if it means barriers, then barriers are not a great thing. I think it does say chicanes in the question. I think in terms of it's all context specific, as Shruti said at the very beginning, and so it's very difficult to answer such a general question. But I think the idea of vertical and horizontal deflection to manage speeds has been around, and we've certainly used that in sort of controlling vehicle speeds. And I think in some instances, and especially in looking at some bus stop bypasses, for instance, there has been, and common practice is to use some vertical or horizontal deflection to sort of, it's not about sort of so much controlling speeds, it's about raising awareness that something's happening, something's changing, the context is changing, so your behavior should change too. And I think those kind of measures are right. I think I'm not quite sure I understand the question about antisocial behavior.
Yeah, I think this was from Cynthia again. So she's saying that there's certain councils are using interventions in public space to discourage certain groups from using them, and that's
got you. Yeah. I always think it's a well-used phrase, but it's a surrender, not a solution. When you start trying to design out the joy of the space so that a certain group of society don't use it. I mean, there was a really good scheme in Brighton that we advised on, and it was a normal street they wanted to make into more of an enhanced street to make it more of a place. They had a problem, they had an issue with street drinking on that street, and there was about 3 benches at the end of the street, and it was so every day quite convivially. There was a group of street drinkers there who were taking part in activities. And when the street came to be reimagined, obviously the idea was to increase seating, and then lots of people were worried about this and didn't want to see more street drinking. And the solution was, rather than put 3 benches there, rather than put 20 benches there, let's put 100 benches there. And the street drinkers still sit in that little spot, but now they're just surrounded with everybody else, because people don't want to sit next to a street drinker, they can sit over there. It gives people more choice, it gives society room to thrive. And I think that idea of finding a solution, not surrendering, is the only way forward.
How would the play standard pick up on that, Shruti? Is that something that could, in terms of, that's not it's a group, an excluded group actually, that you do see on street, and it's a good point. We never really think about them.
That's something that we've done actually. So we've just worked to revise the play standard, and what we've done in there is to support the use of space by different groups, and to encourage the use of space by different groups at different times of day. So the point of teenagers and them often being seen as trouble, we've tried to incorporate some notes within the tool which will help users to realise that isn't the case, and that actually they have a right to own that space and to use the space just as any other group as well. So what we're trying to do there is to kind of change I suppose the thinking around how people are thinking through as they kind of have discussions through the tool. The other thing is around, we've had some feedback that people, obviously against like aspects of the nighttime economy, but actually having a vibrant economy at nighttime in certain places can be a very good thing, and it can provide lots of very opportunities for people, and obviously the space is being used in different ways. So it's just about helping people to understand and raise that awareness that actually, and to challenge some of those negative stereotypes that actually, that there can be positives around this too. There's something around vacant and derelict land as well. So sometimes vacant and derelict land or buildings can be seen as a blight in our neighbourhoods or towns and cities or on our streets. And actually it's about kind of reframing that and asking, well, what opportunities might those present for nature, for wildlife, or kind of for communities to be able to kind of come in and take over those buildings and those spaces. So it's about kind of reframing it so things aren't overseen in a negative way, but also what are the opportunities for communities to transform some of the use of these spaces. And I guess that's where Chris and the kind of the design and the technical aspects would come, is to kind of provide some of those solutions. So that's what we're kind of looking to do, is to kind of change some of the kind of thinking and the conversations from a negative to seeing the positive, and thinking about the opportunities within spaces.
It just makes me think of a little experience I had last week. I went up to the centre of Edinburgh, mainly just from a hobby to take a few photos, and there's a temp scheme up there on Waverley Bridge, which is a busy junction, and the council closed off, put a few planters down, and nobody was really using the space. But last time I was there was a group of younger people, probably late teens, early 20s, just rapping, playing the guitar, slightly louder than some people would like. But I thought, actually, this is good. You know, it's a city centre, it's vibrant, and these guys have found some space, and it was a junction full of noisy traffic. So I thought, so I put that on Twitter to see what response, and I actually was pleasantly surprised that people didn't come back and say this shouldn't be happening. And they were socially distancing as well, I should say. These guys, although they were as a group, they were quite socially distanced, because the police would probably know they were there, but the amount of noise they were making. So, yeah, I think it's good to think about other groups and who's you don't always see on the street, and that they feel welcome to use spaces as well. And we need processes that draw them in. And sometimes it might just be about creating that space in a scheme that is filled later on, I suppose, even though we don't quite know who's going to use it. Somebody will come along and use it if it's the right quality of space. I had a point from Rod King, which I quite like, and he's talking about the fact that we're now going to get mandatory speed limiters on vehicles and how this might affect street design. And he says, let's free street architects from the tyranny of pandering to drivers' insensibilities and instead design streets around people for walking and cycling. So any thoughts on, Chris, are you looking forward to that?
You can't really argue with what Rod's saying there. I think the important thing to think about is we're designing human habitats. We're not designing habitats for cars or anything. We're trying to create environments where human beings can thrive. And if we are designing for something which isn't a human being, we're going to trip up on that, and we're going to start seeing levels of inactivity which are killing people, sort of pollution which is hurting our health. We're going to start seeing that because we're not designing for human beings. So Rod's absolutely on the money there, and the idea of designing for people is the key point.
Great. Okay. Well, our speakers have kindly given up their time, so I think they both need to buzz off pretty quickly. So it's from me to say a big thank you to them for giving us the insights on this topic. Really, really spot on, really interesting. And I've really enjoyed having a conversation with you, and including everybody else. And thanks for answering the questions in this area. This is a kind of ongoing debate for us. We'll probably be asking further questions, but that's been really, really helpful. So thank you for that. I'm just going to close up things actually in terms of next stage. So these events don't sit in isolation. They were kind of backdrop to a paper we've been preparing, which is still available on our website. So if you want to provide any last minute input on that paper, we can still take that on board. But we are in the process of finalising it. We've had a number of organisations that have got back to us, including Mobility and Access Committee Scotland, so that was appreciated. I don't think we were too far away in what we were saying about inclusive streets, but we have been asked to be a little bit more sensitive to issues such as ensuring that we build disabled parking into schemes, and how we treat those type of essential car uses, and we're happy to reflect on that and how that would sit in the paper. So that paper hopefully will be finalised maybe by end of month, so we'll circulate that, and that will set the backdrop to how Living Streets works. But it's a resource for any organisation here that wants to think about how we do this type of stuff better. We've got some we want to be working with other organisations actually in the near future, just to start doing a little bit more stock taking in this area. We think there's more that could be done in terms of best practice, in terms of how schemes are considered and presented. So that's what we're going to try and look at, and to see are we actually picking up and engaging the right people with those sort of things. So there's a small piece of work we're going to do there. And something that struck us as we were doing this, we were talking about the issues of not having enough space and encroachment of vehicles. It's almost exactly a year since we passed legislation in Scotland on banning footway parking. So not a lot has happened now. There is a big excuse the government has in terms of COVID, which we fully accept. But on the other hand, actually COVID and social distancing kind of means we need all the public space we can get. So we will be writing on that level that we would like to see some progress and some timeline for all the groups that are interested in this area. So we'll be reaching out to other organisations that want to join us in that plea. I'm going to close things up, and I'm going to finish on time. And we'll be back again with another series probably early in the new year. And I think the focus will be specifically on young people, because we do a lot of work in this area. I'm going to summarise the day, though. I think it's been really interesting. I've taken from it that we need to think about these things not about individual schemes or objectives, but as a process, and things like the place standard and that stage of the process are very, very important. I think we possibly underestimate things. We need not to constrain ourselves in terms of the amount of space that we make available to designers. So we give them so they don't have to manage as many conflicts, and good infrastructure will help people behave better. Is a nice message, and we can find out what good infrastructure is by actually trialing schemes. They don't need to take so long, is another good thing. But I think the flip side of that is, if we're putting things, we'd really need to ask people what the response is. And challenging briefs, Chris's point that they need to be broader in terms of a fully inclusive street, and the design guidance is improving, but probably needs to be more firmly applied. And it was interesting to hear about that design guidance being something that really is becoming more and more important for street designers that are out there. So I think we all need to check in on that and get up to speed on what that design note says. So that just about closes everything up for me. Thank you for joining us for this series. Danny will be circulating links to this and the other events. We will send around the finalised paper, and we will send details of future events. But don't wait for that. If you want to work with Living Streets on this agenda, get in touch. We're always looking for interesting projects. And even if there isn't funding available, we would try and find the most important for us is having good partners. If we have good partners and good concepts, we can come up with good good projects to take to funders that are out there. So yeah, thanks again to Chris and Shruti. Thanks again to Danny, who's been in the background today, making sure everything has worked. The technology has held up. We've not tried anything too ambitious in this series, which I think has been good. And thank you to everybody who has joined us. So my last word is, stay engaged, stay positive, and stay safe. And we'll hopefully see you again. Thank you very much.